How long have you been asking for that grace you're almost ashamed to name out loud anymore? You asked on your knees. You asked in tears. You asked with a promise attached. And heaven so many times seemed not to listen. On August 20th, the Church remembers a monk named Bernard, the one Catholics have turned to for 800 years when there's no one left to ask. Saint Teresa of Jesus went back and read what that monk wrote centuries before she was born, and she understood something about his prayers that very few of the faithful ever fully grasp. 3 very specific prayers, and a deep reason tucked inside his writings for why yours might still be waiting for an answer. Bernard of Clairvaux wasn't a saint of spectacular miracles or extraordinary visions that stunned kings and crowds. He was, above all, a man who learned to speak to the Virgin with a confidence his own contemporaries found almost impossible to imitate. And there's the question that actually matters. What did those 3 prayers of his have that ordinary prayers, recited without thinking, never managed to hold? Before we go further, write in the comments what that petition is, the one you've been carrying for years without an answer. You don't need to explain the whole thing. Just naming it is already the start of praying it well. What you're about to hear was kept for you the way someone keeps a letter until the exact day it needs opening. And you need to hear it all the way through, because these 3 prayers only carry their full weight once you understand them together. 1113. A newly founded abbey in Burgundy, so poor the monks boiled roots to eat and slept on bare boards. That year, a 22-year-old noble showed up at the gate, thin, sickly, trailing 30 relatives and friends he'd talked into leaving the world behind with him. His name was Bernard, and in less than a generation, this one man would reshape the monastic face of all of Europe. Nobody would have bet on him. His body had been weak since childhood, prone to fevers, to stomach pains that stayed with him his whole life. But he had something no doctor of his time knew how to diagnose: a capacity to love God and to put that love into words that burned inside whoever heard them. Chroniclers called him the Mellifluous Doctor. Honey, they said, came from his mouth. People who heard him preach described a physical sensation, sweet in the throat, as if the words themselves had texture. He founded Clairvaux with those first companions in a spot so bleak it had once been called the Valley of Wormwood for the bitterness of the wild plants growing there. Bernard renamed it Clara Vallis, Clear Valley, and within a few years that bitter valley became one of the most influential abbeys in Christendom. Bishops came out of it, cardinals, a pope. He wrote letters that made kings tremble reading them. He mediated in schisms that split the church between 2 rival popes. He never held an official office to back any of it up. What he had was holiness, recognized even by people who didn't share his faith, and that was enough. But there's something more important than his institutional achievements, something that explains why Catholic tradition made him, century after century, the saint people turn to when there's no one else left to ask. Bernard had a devotion to the Virgin his contemporaries describe with a word that's hard to translate today: tenderness. The kind a child has who knows his mother and knows he can ask her anything without fear of being turned away. A world apart from rote piety, repeated without feeling a thing. They say he preached about Mary with such force that his listeners wept and couldn't stop. And they say too, though this belongs more to popular devotion than to verified historical record, that once, praying before an image of the Virgin and Child, he cried out with his whole soul asking for a sign that he was heard, and the image answered with a gesture of blessing. Legend or not, what's solidly documented are his writings: 86 complete sermons devoted to explaining the Song of Songs as an image of the soul restlessly searching for God, and a short treatise, De Laudibus Virginis Matris, where he lays out with theological precision why turning to Mary in desperate moments is, above all, an act of spiritual wisdom. something many people mistake for weakness without understanding what it actually means. The Church sets his feast on August 20th, the day he died in the year 1153, after a lifetime spent on work, prayer, and an illness that never fully let go of him. He died in the same abbey he'd founded as a 22-year-old, surrounded by the monks who'd grown up under his spiritual government. Centuries later, Pope Pius VIII declared him a doctor of the Church, adding his name to the short list of saints whose teaching the whole Church recognizes as sure guidance. By the time he died, Clairvaux had gone on to found 68 more abbeys, scattered across Europe from Ireland to Portugal. Each one carried something of the spirit of that sickly young man who arrived at the Valley of Wormwood with nothing but his faith. Dante, centuries later, chose him as his final guide through paradise, precisely because in Catholic tradition, Bernard stood as the bridge between human contemplation and Mary's intercession. So why him exactly, and not some other saint just as wise, just as holy, who over the centuries became the unofficial patron of impossible causes? The answer isn't in a decree or some special canonization for that title. It's in something far more concrete, in the exact way Bernard taught people to ask. Because there's a difference between asking and pleading that most of the faithful never fully grasp. And Bernard lived it with a clarity that marked everyone who came after him, including a Spanish nun born 4 centuries later, who would find in his writings something that would change forever the way she turned to heaven when nothing else seemed to work. Saint Teresa of Jesus read Bernard of Clairvaux with the attention of someone who recognizes her own experience in another. In her letters and spiritual treatises, the Saint of Avila cites the great Cistercian masters with a frequency that surprises anyone unfamiliar with her formation. At the convent of the Incarnation, where she spent much of her religious life before the Carmelite reform, books of monastic spirituality circulated among the sisters with an almost reverent care, and Bernard's works were among the most worn from use. Something in Bernard's way of asking marked Teresa in a way that left a visible imprint on her own teaching about the prayer of petition, the kind so many people get wrong without the soul praying it ever noticing. Knowing the right words, reciting formulas with liturgical precision mattered less than something that comes much earlier. What happens before the mouth opens on the first syllable, that inner disposition that decides whether a prayer arrives carrying real spiritual weight or just floats there, repeated out of habit more than living faith. Memorare, remember. That word opens the first of the 3 prayers Catholic tradition attributes to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, though historians still argue over whether he composed it himself or simply spread it with such force that his name got permanently attached to it. It's one of the most prayed Marian prayers in the Catholic world, and yet few of the faithful ever stop to look closely at its inner structure, the architecture that makes it something far deeper than a simple formula. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to your protection, implored your help, or sought your intercession was left unaided. That's how it opens, in its most widespread English form. And there's the first key most people miss in the rush to recite it from memory. It doesn't open with asking, it opens with remembering. Before pleading for anything, whoever prays the Memorare performs an act of memory. He remembers an entire history, centuries of the faithful who came before him, generation after generation who placed their most desperate causes in Mary's hands, and not one of them, not a single one, was left unattended. That memory works as the foundation everything else is built on, far more than a poetic flourish tacked onto the opening. Because whoever starts asking without memory, without that living recollection that others were heard before, asks with an inner fragility that weakens the plea itself. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this with a clarity that runs through her entire teaching on prayer. In the book of her life, she describes in detail how vocal prayer, said with distraction, without the soul paying attention to what's being said, barely reaches God with any real force. And when the soul accompanies the words with real attention, with the heart set on what the mouth is saying, that same vocal prayer becomes a path to deep union. What it takes, above all, is real presence. The soul actually there, inside every word, instead of wandering off into other thoughts, while the lips repeat a text memorized decades ago. The memorare demands exactly that presence. It doesn't work on autopilot because its first line is an act of active memory that requires attention. When someone prays it truly remembering, calling to mind specific cases, stories they've heard, documented miracles, or simply the certainty handed down through generations of Catholics, that person is building inside themselves the confidence needed to ask with real faith for what comes next. And that's where a lot of the faithful go wrong. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. There's the second movement of the memorare, the explicit recognition of one's own condition. A sinner who groans, who knows himself small before the greatness of what he's asking, with no pretense of his own greatness. That humility, far from weakening confidence, is exactly what makes full confidence possible. Because a soul that admits its smallness no longer expects to earn the grace on its own merit. It expects it out of pure mercy. Bernard understood this from the very core of his monastic formation. All of Cistercian spirituality insists on the humble recognition of one's own misery as the door into divine grace. Seeing clearly who is asking and who is being asked, and holding that distance without letting it collapse into despair. That's what it teaches. Nothing like artificial self-deprecation or the false modesty that underneath hides pride. The prayer continues, "Despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer them." That's where the memorare ends in its classic form, with a final petition that sums up everything before it. Memory of those who were heard, recognition of one's smallness, and finally the direct plea, now carrying the weight the two earlier movements gave it. 3 steps: memory, humility, petition. In that exact order and no other. How often, without realizing it, does a human petition skip those first 2 steps and go straight to the third in a rush? How often does someone pray for something urgent, something that hurts deep down, without first pausing to remember that God and His Mother have heard others in equally desperate circumstances, without pausing to honestly admit their own condition before God? That prayer, said that way, hurried, without the foundation the memorare teaches you to build first, can still be valid. God hears even the clumsiest petition made with sincere faith, but it lacks the force of a prayer built on living memory and real humility. Saint Bernard preached this structure throughout his entire life as abbot, and his monks at Clairvaux absorbed it until it became part of their daily spiritual breathing. Monastic chronicles say that whenever some extraordinary need arose, a lost harvest, an illness threatening the whole monastery, Bernard would gather everyone in front of the image of the Virgin to pray together, following that exact order. Memory first, then humility, and only then the petition. It's no coincidence that centuries later, a Spanish Carmelite found in that same structure something she recognized as a deep truth about the nature of petitionary prayer. Something she would go on to teach her own daughters in her own words, but resting on the same inner foundation Bernard had laid down in the 12th century. Teresa insisted that her nuns approach God as daughters, who remember, who know themselves small, and who for that very reason dare to ask with full confidence, never like someone reciting a list of needs to a distracted clerk. That's the shared root between the 12th century French monk and the 16th century Spanish reformer, united by the same deep understanding of what it means to truly plead. 1130. Rome was living through one of the darkest moments in its ecclesial history. Pope Honorius VI died, and within hours, with the funeral prayers barely finished echoing in the churches, Two cardinal factions elected two different men to succeed him. Innocent II on one side, and Cletus II on the other. Two popes, one church, split down the middle, with bishops, kings, and entire kingdoms forced to decide which one to obey. Each side had its own legal arguments for the legitimacy of its election, and both had cardinals ready to defend it to the end. The chaos was immediate. Anacletus, with money and powerful backers in Rome, managed to seize control of the city. Innocent had to flee, taking refuge first in France, desperately seeking the backing of kings and bishops who could hand him back what he considered rightfully his. For nearly 8 years, all of Christendom lived divided, every kingdom, every diocese, every monastery forced to pick a side in a dispute that seemed to have no possible solution. Some historians consider it the most dangerous schism the Church suffered before the great rupture of the 16th century. Bernard of Clairvaux, then an abbot barely 40 years old, with no rank in the Church hierarchy, no army, no fortune of his own, was called on to intervene. Nobody expected a Cistercian monk to do anything about a disaster of that size. Kings had their counselors, cardinals had their interests, and the dispute seemed destined to be settled only by force of arms, or by one side simply wearing out the other. But Bernard traveled. He crossed France, Germany, all of Italy, meeting personally with kings, with emperors, with wavering bishops who didn't know which side to follow. He spoke before Emperor Lothair II and won him over to Innocent's side. He faced down the King of Aquitaine, who backed Anacletus for political reasons and got him to switch sides after a confrontation the chronicles describe as intense, almost physical in its persuasive force. He preached before crowds that filled entire squares, explaining with a clarity no one else could match why legitimacy lay with Innocent and not his rival. During those years, Bernard fell seriously ill more than once. His body, always fragile, buckled under the weight of constant travel, sleepless nights, the strain of negotiations that could collapse at any moment and set off open war between Christian kingdoms. His own monks at Clairvaux came to fear for his life. They wrote him letters begging him to come home, to rest, to leave the dispute in other hands. Bernard's answer, preserved by his biographers, was that he'd rather die doing what he believed was God's will than live knowing he'd abandoned the Church in her hour of greatest need. There's one moment in particular that tradition preserves in special detail. Bernard was exhausted, sick, with no certainty his effort would ever amount to anything, in a small chapel during one of his many journeys. The cause looked lost. Anacletus still controlled Rome, had resources Innocent could never match, and several important kingdoms still refused to commit either way. It was in that moment of total exhaustion, according to the pious tradition handed down by his disciples, that Bernard knelt before an image of the Virgin and prayed with the same structure he would later teach through the Memorare. He remembered first. He recognized his own smallness after. And only then did he plead, with his whole soul, for a way out of what seemed humanly unsolvable. Nobody knows with documented historical certainty exactly what he said in that chapel. Medieval biographers, used to narrating the lives of saints with a mix of verified fact and devotional piety, passed the scene down as part of Clairvaux's living memory, without claiming it to be a notarized account. What is solidly historical is what happened next. Anacletus died in 1138, never having managed to consolidate his position despite all his resources, and his successor resigned barely 2 months later under the combined pressure of ecclesiastical opinion and Bernard's tireless insistence. The schism ended. Innocent II was recognized as the legitimate pope by all of Western Christendom, and the Church's unity, which for 8 years had seemed impossible to restore, became a reality again. Sit with what that actually means. A schism dividing entire kingdoms turning brothers in faith against each other, that seemed destined to end only by brute force or by one side simply running out of energy. And in the middle of that chaos, a sick man with no army, no fortune, held up only by prayer and by a confidence that didn't depend on his own strength, ended up being the instrument that restored unity to the whole church. Modern historians, even ones with no particular religious sympathy analyzing these episodes, acknowledge that Bernard's personal intervention was absolutely decisive to how it turned out. Without him, several academic studies of the period say, the schism could have dragged on for decades with unpredictable consequences for all of Christian Europe. 8 years of division, one sick monk with no formal power, no army, no weapon but his word and his prayer. And in the end, what looked completely unsolvable got resolved through years of sustained work, exhausting travel, difficult negotiations, and a prayer Bernard kept repeating as the foundation underneath everything else. Nothing sudden, nothing instant. A long process, carried forward step by step by the same structure of faith he would later teach through the Memorar. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable lesson in this whole story. When the impossible gets resolved, it almost never happens in a single miraculous instant. It happens because somebody held on to hope long enough for God to act. The second prayer tradition links to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He didn't write, but he spread it with such fervor his name became inseparable from it. It's the Salve Regina, the Marian antiphon, that closes so many days of prayer in convents and parishes around the Catholic world. According to an old pious tradition, Bernard, hearing it sung for the first time in a church in Speyer, dropped spontaneously to his knees at the words, "O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary," and added the brief invocation, still repeated at the end of the hymn today, exactly as he left it. "Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope, to Thee do we cry. To Thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, Thine eyes of mercy toward us." That's how the Salve unfolds, word by word, describing a human condition any believer recognizes without effort. Exile, weeping, the thirst for comfort in the middle of a world that hurts. But there's one word in particular, just one, that most of the faithful say without ever pausing to weigh its full meaning. Advocate. In Latin, advocata, a precise legal term, taken straight from Roman legal vocabulary, nothing like some decorative expression of spiritual courtesy. It names the one who defends a case before a tribunal, who actively intercedes for someone in front of an authority with power to decide. Saint Teresa of Jesus grasped this nuance with a depth that shows up in the Way of Perfection, where she describes properly said vocal prayer as prayer in which the soul understands who it's speaking to and what it's asking, rather than simply repeating sounds with no real substance behind them. When someone prays the salve understanding the legal and spiritual weight of the word advocate, that person isn't just asking for emotional comfort. She's invoking Mary in her precise function as intercessor before the highest court that exists, the court of God's own mercy. That understanding changes the interior disposition someone brings to the prayer. Pleading for comfort in a vague, diffuse way is not the same as formally presenting a case before someone who has the authority to argue on its behalf. Bernard, trained in the categories of canon law, understood this distinction perfectly, and that's why he insisted his monks grasp the exact meaning of every word they said in the liturgy, rather than reciting it from memory with no real awareness of its content. The Salve ends with a very specific petition. And after this, our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. There's the ultimate destination of the whole prayer. It asks for relief in the present, yes, but above all it looks further ahead, the definitive vision of Christ at the end of the road. It's a prayer that holds on to hope even in the middle of present tears, because it recognizes that exile has an end, and that end is an encounter, not an emptiness. Saint Bernard taught his monks that praying the salve with that double awareness, the present that hurts and the future that comforts, was essential for the prayer to do its full work. It's not enough to name the suffering of the present if you don't hold, at the same time, the hope of the final encounter. And it's not enough to cling to some abstract hope if you don't honestly face the real weight of what you're living through right now. Both together, acknowledged tears and sustained hope, are what give the salve its full spiritual force. There's a historical detail few people know about this antiphon. For centuries, in many Cistercian monasteries, the salve was sung at the end of the day, at the last hour of communal prayer, right before the monks retired into complete silence until the following dawn. It was literally the last thing they said before entering the night's rest, a way of entrusting each day with its failures and its small victories to Mary's intercession before closing their eyes. Bernard insisted that moment of the day carried a particular spiritual weight, because a soul that gives itself to sleep, trusting in Mary's advocacy, rests differently than a soul that goes to bed carrying anxiety it never handed off to anyone. Saint Teresa of Jesus applied this same principle in her own prayer life. In the book of her life, she describes how, in her driest spiritual seasons, when God seemed absent and vocal prayer fell flat, she'd go back precisely to formulas like the salve, resting on the doctrinal certainty that Mary is advocate even when the soul feels no sensible comfort in the moment. Faith, she taught, holds on to the truth of what's believed, even when feeling is completely absent. That's the second lesson Saint Teresa of Jesus drew from the Bernardine tradition. Praying with an understanding of the exact title being invoked, holding on to hope even without feeling any comfort right away, trusting that the true advocate is at work even when the soul hasn't yet noticed any visible effect of her intercession. This teaching has a very concrete application for anyone who has spent years asking for something that seems impossible. How often does someone give up on a prayer precisely because no feeling of comfort ever comes? No perceptible sign that anything is moving on the other side. Bernard and Saint Teresa of Jesus, centuries later following the same line, taught exactly the opposite, that the absence of sensible comfort doesn't mean the absence of real intercession. The advocate keeps working, keeps presenting the case, even when the one praying feels nothing different inside. Holding that certainty without needing constant emotional confirmation is what separates mature prayer from prayer that depends on the mood of the moment. The third prayer is different from the first two. No fixed formula recited word for word across all of Christendom. It's more a disposition of the soul, a specific way of handing yourself over to God when there are no more words of your own left to express what you need. Saint Bernard taught it to his monks in their darkest spiritual desolation, when the interior dryness ran so deep that no vocal prayer, however beautiful, could break through anymore. Bernard called this disposition confident silence before God. He described it at length in his sermons on the Song of Songs, that biblical book he read, as an image of the soul searching for God in the middle of the night, not finding him, not feeling him, but never stopping the search either. He wrote that there are moments in the spiritual life when words run out, when the soul has asked so much and in so many ways that it can't find new formulas to express its need. And that precisely in that exhaustion, the possibility opens for a surrender far deeper than any petition put into words. The sick monk, past 60 years old by then, went through this exact experience himself in the last years of his long life. After decades of relentless work, of travel, of exhausting political negotiations, of constant preaching that had left his body wrecked, Bernard faced a season of spiritual dryness his own biographers described with unusual bluntness. He felt God had pulled away. His habitual prayers, the ones he'd said his whole life with real fervor, suddenly felt empty to him, mechanical, unable to touch anything real. The monks close to him during those hard years recorded specific episodes of this deep interior struggle. There's a letter of his, addressed to a brother in the habit, where he openly admits he'd gone weeks without feeling anything at all in prayer, and that only disciplined habit, built over years of practice, kept him on his knees every morning despite the total dryness inside him. He wrote that in those moments he understood something he'd never fully grasped in his years of stronger fervor, that the purest fidelity is measured by what you keep doing when you feel absolutely nothing, far more than by the passing emotion of the moment. It was during this period that he developed his fullest teaching on confident silence. He wrote that when the soul can no longer find words, it can still hand itself over completely, unconditionally, without demanding to feel anything in return. This surrender, he said, has little to do with passive resignation or indifference to the outcome of the petition. It is, on the contrary, the highest form of trust, because the soul that surrenders this way recognizes that God knows better than she does what she truly needs, even when that need doesn't match what the soul believes it's asking for. Saint Teresa of Jesus developed this same teaching with extraordinary depth in the interior castle, particularly when describing the innermost dwelling places of the soul, where union with God rests on a surrender of the will, far beyond words or perceptible feelings, capable of holding firm even in the deepest darkness. She wrote that there are souls who, after years of fervent prayer, reach a point where they feel they've lost all ability to pray the way they used to, and that this point, far from being a spiritual setback, can be exactly the threshold of a much deeper union with the divine will. Saint Teresa of Jesus' own history sheds particular light on this teaching. She herself went through long stretches of what she called dryness of spirit, moments when prayer turned arid, difficult, almost impossible to sustain with the fervor of before. And yet, precisely in those stretches, she learned that fidelity is measured by staying present before God, surrendered, more than by feeling constant comfort, even when the soul experiences nothing that sensibly confirms that presence. Bernard and Saint Teresa of Jesus agree on something that surprises anyone who's never gone deep into Catholic mystical tradition. The most powerful prayer isn't always the most eloquent or the most keenly felt. Sometimes the most powerful prayer is simply the one that keeps going without giving up, the one that keeps showing up before God, even when it seems no one on the other side is listening. That silent persistence, that surrender that doesn't demand immediate confirmation, is the third prayer both saints taught, each from their own century, each from their own experience of desolation turned into radical trust. Think about how many times you've stopped asking for something simply because heaven seemed to stay quiet. Think about how many prayers you abandoned halfway through because no sign came, no comforting sensation confirming it was worth continuing. Bernard, sick and exhausted in his final years, and Saint Teresa of Jesus, going through her own documented seasons of spiritual dryness, teach something different. That it's exactly there, in the thickest silence, where the most important part of prayer plays out, far more than in the initial petition, so often easy to say with enthusiasm. That's where sustained fidelity gets tested, once that enthusiasm disappears completely. These three prayers, said without the right interior disposition, ring hollow. The Church has taught this since her earliest centuries, far beyond some isolated idea from a particular theologian. It's a core part of Catholic doctrine on petitionary prayer. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, in paragraph 2721, reminds us that Christian prayer is above all a living relationship, an encounter with God that requires a willing heart, far more than a recited formula waiting for automatic results. Saint Augustine, centuries before Bernard of Clairvaux, had already reflected deeply on this same question that weighs so heavily on the human heart. In his writings on prayer, the great Bishop of Hippo taught that God always hears the sincere petition, but that the answer doesn't always arrive in the shape the human heart imagines, because God sees further than a man can see of his own need. That Augustinian teaching runs through all of later Catholic spirituality, including Bernard's, including Saint Teresa of Jesus 4 centuries later. There's an important theological distinction worth clarifying right here. A petition going unanswered right away doesn't mean God has ignored the one praying. The Catholic faith firmly teaches that God always answers, but that answer can take 3 very different forms: granting exactly what was asked, granting something better than what was asked, even if the soul takes years to recognize it, or denying it for reasons that go beyond present human understanding, but that eternity will eventually reveal with complete clarity. Saint Teresa of Jesus developed this doctrine in the way of perfection, in a way particularly accessible to her nuns, many of whom had no formal theological training. She wrote that true petitionary prayer is nowhere close to imposing your own will on God disguised as pious pleading. It consists of presenting the need with complete sincerity and trust, leaving the manner and timing of the answer to God. That distinction, subtle as it seems, completely changes the spiritual experience of someone praying for years without seeing visible results. So many of the faithful abandon prayer precisely because they confuse the absence of an immediate answer with God's total, final silence. Saint Bernard, in his letters to discouraged monks who confessed to him they'd lost hope after years of fruitless pleading, kept coming back to one principle. Perseverance in prayer has little to do with stubbornness or blind obstinacy. It is above all sustained fidelity that trusts God is working even through the longest silence. The Gospel itself offers an example both Bernard and Saint Teresa of Jesus cited often in their teaching on perseverance. The parable of the persistent widow, told by Luke, shows a woman who keeps going before an unjust judge until he, worn down by her persistence, finally grants what she's asking. Christ himself explains the point of the parable. If an unjust judge eventually gives in to persistence, how much more will God, who is just and merciful, hear those who cry out day and night without losing heart? This parable dismantles a mistaken idea a lot of the faithful carry without realizing it: the belief that asking repeatedly proves a lack of faith, as if true trust meant asking once and then quietly resigning yourself. Biblical tradition and the teaching of the saints point exactly the opposite direction. Asking with faith, coming back again and again to the same plea, holding it for months or years, is precisely the sign of deep trust, not its absence. Anyone who stops asking because they believe insisting would be a lack of humility completely misunderstands what Bernard and Saint Teresa of Jesus centuries later taught so clearly and so firmly about this very concrete point of everyday spiritual life. Bernard taught his monks there was a clear difference between anxious insistence, loaded with distrust toward God, and confident insistence, loaded with sustained hope. The first wears down the soul and almost always ends in bitterness or complete abandonment of faith. The second instead strengthens the one praying, even when the answer takes years to arrive, because every new petition becomes a renewal of the original trust, not a desperate repetition of the same demand. This difference shows up, Bernard said, in the inner tone of the plea as it's repeated. Someone praying out of anxiety prays each time with more urgency, more tension in the chest, almost demanding an immediate answer from God to confirm they're still being heard. Someone praying out of trust, on the other hand, can repeat the same petition for years with a calm that doesn't depend on the outcome. His faith rests on the faithfulness of the one he's asking, far more than on the speed of the answer. Saint Bernard compared this second attitude to a farmer who sows without yet seeing the fruit, trusting the land will give, in its own time, what's owed. Saint Teresa of Jesus passed on a similar image to her nuns, drawn from her own experience founding convents. She'd tell them that many times she'd asked God for concrete resources to keep a foundation going, money she needed urgently, church permits that took forever to arrive, and that more than once whole months went by with nothing seeming to move at all. And yet, she wrote, when help finally came, it almost always arrived so differently from what she'd imagined that only then did she understand why God had waited until that exact moment to grant it. The book of her Foundations, where she narrates these experiences in remarkable detail, is full of episodes where the long wait ended up revealing a providence far more precise than the saint could ever have planned on her own. One family in Puebla, Mexico, generation after generation, has passed down with great affection a particular story tied precisely to August 20th. A woman named Guadalupe tells it today, 72 years old, who first heard it as a girl from her own grandmother, who'd received it in turn from hers. It isn't documented in any official church archive, and it's worth saying plainly from the start. This is a testimony of popular devotion, passed down by word of mouth inside a Catholic family, not a fact verified by any formal canonical process. And yet, like so many stories Catholic families carry forward generation after generation, it lights up with real force what doctrine explains in more abstract words. Guadalupe's great-grandfather family tradition says, faced back in the 1930s a situation that seemed to have absolutely no way out. His small leather working shop, the one supporting a large family, was about to be lost over a debt he couldn't pay by any means he could see. The final deadline landed exactly on August 20th, and there was no human way to raise the money in time. His wife, a woman of deep faith formed in the popular piety of her region, taught him the 3 prayers her own mother had passed down to her, attributed to Saint Bernard, though neither of them knew with any historical precision who had actually composed each one. She told him to pray them in a specific order in the days before the deadline. First, the Memorare, remembering in faith that no one who'd come before had been left unaided. Then the Salve, invoking Mary explicitly as advocate in his particular cause. And finally, in silence, with no words, the total surrender of the outcome into God's hands, accepting ahead of time that the answer might not come the way he expected. The house they lived in, as Guadalupe describes it when she tells this story to her own grandchildren, was small, made of adobe, with a workshop attached where the great-grandfather worked leather from before dawn until well into the night. They had 7 children to feed. The debt threatening to take away the business wasn't some abstract figure on paper. It meant very concretely the difference between eating 3 meals a day or not. His wife prayed beside him every night, kneeling in front of a small image of Our Lady of Guadalupe inherited from the great-grandfather's own parents, the same image that the family says still hangs today in Guadalupe's own home. The great-grandfather, the family says, prayed this way for 9 straight days, a kind of improvised novena his wife had suggested, without knowing she was unknowingly repeating the same structure Saint Bernard taught his monks 800 years before. On August 19th, one day before the deadline, nothing visible had happened. No unexpected customer, no word from some distant relative willing to help, no outward sign that things were about to work out. On the morning of August 20th, Guadalupe says her great-grandmother always told it with damp eyes. Full of feeling, an old customer the great-grandfather barely even remembered. An important local landowner who owed him for work paid years before and had vanished without a trace after some old family dispute, showed up at the shop without warning. He'd come to settle a very old debt, forgotten for years, that happened to cover exactly what was needed to pay off the debt, threatening to sink the business that very day. Guadalupe always underlines one detail that still strikes her, now grown, as the most significant part of this whole beloved family story. Her great-grandfather, she says, didn't recognize that visit right away as a direct answer to his own prayer. Several days passed before, talking it over with his wife, he realized the date, the exact amount, and the person showing up out of nowhere after years of no contact, lined up in a way that no longer looked like coincidence to him. The answer had arrived on exactly the day he'd asked for it, just dressed in a way his human mind hadn't known how to recognize at first. This family story, passed down with no pretense of formal historical rigor, reflects something Catholic doctrine explains with clear theological precision. God's answer rarely arrives with the label on, announcing outright that it's the fruit of the prayer that was said. It comes dressed as coincidence, as a chance meeting, as circumstance that a heart rushed by urgency takes time to recognize for what it really is. Recognizing it takes precisely the kind of memory the memorare talks about, the ability to look back and see, calmly, what in the moment seemed like plain luck. How many times has something similar happened in your own life without your recognizing it in time? How many answers to old prayers maybe arrived disguised as coincidence, as an unexpected encounter, as a call you weren't expecting, as a door that opened right when it seemed like every door was closed? Guadalupe always ends this story with the same line she heard her great-grandmother say dozens of times growing up, that God never arrives late, but he almost always arrives dressed in a way a rushed heart doesn't recognize until enough time passes to look back calmly. That line, handed down generation after generation in a simple family from central Mexico, sums up in a few words exactly what Saint Bernard taught in his 12th century sermons, and what Saint Teresa of Jesus would confirm centuries later from her own experience as a foundress, waiting for help that always came at the moment and in the shape she least expected. But that turned out to be exactly what was needed. 3 prayers: memory, humility, surrender. The memorare, which remembers before it asks, calling to mind centuries of the faithful who were heard before you. The salve, which invokes the true advocate, recognizing your own smallness while holding onto hope even in the deepest tears. And the confident silence that hands over the final outcome without demanding to feel comfort right away, held up by the certainty that God is at work even when nothing seems to be moving. That's the full structure Saint Bernard of Clairvaux left the Church, forged in his own life of illness, exhausting travel, and ecclesial crises resolved against every human expectation. And that Saint Teresa of Jesus, 4 centuries later, recognized as a sure path through whatever seems humanly impossible. But there's a question still hanging in the air, the one you've maybe been asking yourself since the start of this story. Why these 3 prayers exactly and not some other pious formula according to Saint Teresa of Jesus' own teaching? The answer is in something the Saint of Avila wrote in the interior castle with a clarity that crosses the centuries. Petitionary prayer works above all through the interior disposition those words train and sustain in the soul that repeats them with real faith, far more than through some magical power in a fixed set of words. The memorare trains the memory of God's faithfulness. The salve trains the recognition of your own smallness alongside sustained hope. Confident silence trains the total surrender of the outcome. 3 distinct dispositions, complementary to each other, that together form a complete spiritual path through any petition that seems to have no way out. Far from being magic formulas that automatically guarantee the requested result, they train the soul to ask well. And asking well is, as Saint Teresa of Jesus taught throughout her entire spiritual life, the necessary condition for prayer to bear its full fruit. Saint Teresa of Jesus explained this with an image her nuns kept with particular fondness, passed down orally in Carmel for generations before it was ever written down. She compared the soul praying without the right disposition to someone pounding on a locked door with the wrong hand, pushing hard but never finding the real key that opens it. And she compared the soul praying with the 3 dispositions learned from Bernardine tradition to someone who, even if it takes a while to find the exact key, eventually holds it in hand and knows for certain the door will open, even without knowing yet the precise moment it will happen. None of this means every petition made with these 3 prayers automatically gets what was asked for in the exact terms the heart imagined. Catholic doctrine is clear on this point, already explained in detail above. God always answers, but He may grant exactly what was asked, grant something better than what was asked, or deny it for reasons eternity will reveal. What these three prayers guarantee is the right disposition of the soul asking far more than any specific outcome. Saint Teresa of Jesus, by her own writing, considered that disposition more important than the actual content of the petition itself. August 20th, then, is much more than just the date the Church remembers a sick monk who reshaped the face of all of Europe. For anyone who approaches it with this fuller understanding, it becomes an especially fitting day to pick back up that petition you've been carrying for years, that caused you'd almost stop naming out loud because discouragement kept gaining ground with time. Go back to it today. Remember first, as the Memorare teaches, that no one who came before with sincere faith was ever left unaided. Recognize your own smallness after, as the Salve teaches, without shame or false self-sufficiency. And finally, surrender the outcome, as Bernard taught in his confident silence, holding the petition without demanding it arrive, dressed exactly the way you imagined it. Saint Teresa of Jesus learned this structure from a monk who lived 4 centuries before her, and lived it with such depth that today, 800 years after Bernard's death, it remains a sure path for any soul facing what looks completely impossible. Take a moment calmly to look back over the whole road we've walked together to get here. A sickly young man who arrived at a bitter valley with nothing but his faith. An abbot who resolved, through sustained prayer and tireless work, the most dangerous schism the Church suffered before the great rupture of the 16th century. A spiritual master who left behind 3 prayers, whose inner structure, centuries later, a Spanish nun recognized as a sure path for her own life of faith. And a Mexican family, centuries later still, who, without knowing the theology behind those prayers, prayed them with the same simple faith and received an answer that took days to recognize as such. That's the chain linking August 20th of the year 1153, the day Bernard died, to this same August 20th coming up on your own calendar. A chain of faith handed down generation after generation, century after century, never broken, carried by men and women who learned to ask with memory, with humility, and with total surrender, and who found, sooner or later, that their most impossible causes found a way through that human reason alone could never have mapped out. You're part of that same chain now too, even if you didn't know it until this very moment. The petition you've been holding on to, the one you'd almost stopped naming, can start a different journey today if you dare to pray it in the exact order a sick monk taught 800 years ago and a Spanish saint confirmed with her entire life. You made it all the way here, to the end of this whole story. And that, in itself, already says something important about the faith you carry inside, even if today it feels tired, even if it's spent years waiting for an answer that still hasn't come. Now you're holding something very few Catholics know with this depth. The exact structure of 3 prayers a sick 12th century monk left to the whole Church, and that a Spanish saint, centuries later, recognized as a sure path through what looks humanly impossible. You know now that the Memorare is, above all, an act of remembering God's faithfulness before pleading for anything. Nothing like a formula recited from memory without a thought. You know the Salve invokes Mary with a precise legal title, advocate, and that praying it with that awareness completely changes the inner disposition of whoever says it. You know too that there's a 3rd prayer lived in silence, handing over the final outcome without demanding to feel immediate comfort, trusting that God is at work even when nothing seems to be moving on the other side. You know now the story of a man who arrived at a bitter valley with nothing but his faith, who fell ill again and again, who traveled exhausted across half of Europe to heal the most dangerous schism the Church suffered before the great rupture of the 16th century. A man who learned, in his own worn-out body that the impossible almost never resolves all at once, but through years of sustained fidelity. And you know too how Saint Teresa of Jesus, 4 centuries later, found in those same writings something she recognized as a deep truth for her own life of prayer, something she taught her Carmelite daughters in her own words, but resting on the same interior foundation Bernard had laid down centuries before. None of what you just heard was by chance. You arrived at this story at a specific moment in your life, maybe carrying that very petition you've been holding for years, that caused you to almost stop naming out loud. And now you're holding something far more valuable than a simple historical explanation, a method proven by 800 years of Catholic faith, handed down generation after generation until it reached one way or another you. Staying to the end of this story was really a kind of preparation, because now, when you go back to that petition you've been carrying, you'll pray it differently than you did before. You'll pray with memory, with humility, with surrender, and that inner disposition, as Saint Teresa of Jesus taught with the firmness of someone who lived it herself, is exactly what turns a prayer repeated without force into a plea capable of moving heaven. There's one more thing I want to leave you with before I go, because it connects directly to everything you just heard and to what comes after this. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wasn't the only Saint Catholic tradition connects with causes that seemed lost beyond any human remedy. 800 years of church history are full of men and women who faced impossible situations and found, each in their own way, a path of faith that human reason alone never would have mapped. Think of Saint Jude Thaddeus, invoked for centuries precisely for desperate causes, with a history and a devotion of his own that very few know in any depth, tied to his standing as an almost forgotten apostle among the 12, and, precisely for that reason, turned into a refuge for those who feel forgotten by everyone. Think of Saint Rita of Castia, the saint of the impossible, who lived through a violent marriage, the loss of her children, and a lifetime marked by suffering that seemed to have no way out, until she found in the convent a peace that transformed her whole story. Think of Saint Expeditus, whose popular devotion grew precisely among people who needed an urgent answer to situations that couldn't wait any longer. A soldier turned into a symbol of faith that can't wait until tomorrow. Each of these saints lived out their own personal relationship with the impossible, each from their own era and their own particular circumstance. Each taught from their own lived experience a particular way of holding on to hope when everything seems lost with no remedy at all. And just as you understood something new today about Saint Bernard's 3 prayers, there's still so much more to discover about these other companions on the road that the Church has offered generation after generation to anyone facing what humanly seems beyond remedy. Saint Teresa of Jesus herself had a particular relationship with several of these intercessor saints. Her writings mention specific devotions she practiced herself in moments of special need, ways of asking she developed across decades of religious life, marked by constant difficulty, foundations that seemed impossible to pull off in towns where nobody wanted to give up land for a poor convent, church opposition that threatened to shut down her reform of Carmel entirely, illnesses that stayed with her for much of her life and more than once left her bedridden for weeks on end. Each of those difficulties found in the Saint of Avila a concrete spiritual answer, a particular way of turning to heaven that still lights the way today for anyone who approaches her legacy with attention and a heart ready to learn. There are stories of other saints, other specific dates on the liturgical calendar, other Teresian teachings on prayer and trust that you haven't heard yet, and that might give you exactly what you need in this particular moment of your life. Maybe you're carrying a different petition tied to a different circumstance, and there's a saint whose specific story, whose specific intercession fits in a way you don't know yet with what you're going through right now. That's how rich the Catholic faith is. It unfolds across an enormous tapestry of intercessors, of stories, of teaching gathered over 2,000 years of church life, each with something particular to offer anyone who searches with sincerity and perseverance. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, with her teaching on petitionary prayer, is just one of many voices Catholic tradition offers anyone needing to strengthen their faith in truly difficult moments. Before you get on with your day, let me leave you with one last thought that connects directly to everything you learned here today. Bernard spent 8 full years resolving the schism that split the church in two. 8 years of exhausting travel, recurring illness, difficult negotiations that often seemed to lead nowhere at all. And yet, every single one of those days, for 8 years straight, he kept praying with the same structure of memory, humility, and surrender you learned about today too. Not because he saw immediate results confirming his effort. The results came at the end, after a long time of sustained fidelity, with no visible guarantee things would ever be resolved. Your own petition, the one you've been carrying maybe for months or even years, deserves that same sustained fidelity. Don't abandon it, because heaven seems to be staying quiet today. That silence, as you learned in the story of the Mexican family who prayed 9 days straight without seeing anything until the very last moment of the very last day, doesn't mean God's absence. It often means the answer is already on its way, taking the exact shape your particular situation needs, even if you can't recognize it clearly yet. There's so much more to explore on these themes. Other saints with equally moving stories, other old prayers handed down generation after generation inside devout Catholic families, other teachings from Saint Teresa of Jesus on how to hold on to hope when everything seems lost and the heart can barely find the strength to keep asking. Every story the Church has preserved for centuries has something concrete to offer you, something that might fit exactly what your heart needs to hear in this precise moment of your own walk of faith, in this particular season of your life that only you know with all its weight and all its hope. And now, before letting you go until next time, I want to walk with you all the way to this last moment, like someone who walks you to the door and doesn't leave without a sincere, warm goodbye. Carry these 3 prayers with you. Keep them close to your heart. The Memorare, which teaches you to remember before you ask. The Salve, which teaches you to see yourself as small before an advocate who never abandons the one who comes to her in faith. And that confident silence Saint Bernard learned in his own illness, in his own years of spiritual dryness, and handed down to the whole Church as a sure path for when there are no more words left. Saint Teresa of Jesus, who walked this same spiritual road centuries later, left us a beautiful certainty I want to give you before saying goodbye for good, that the soul who perseveres in prayer with faith, even if it takes years to see the fruit, never goes unanswered, because God, she said firmly, never tires of giving to those who never tire of asking with humility. May Saint Bernard of Clairvaux intercede for that cause you've been carrying for so long. May the Virgin, our advocate, turn her merciful eyes toward you this August 20th and every day still to come, every dawn you have left to live. And may you find, in the silence of your own prayer, the same deep peace a sick monk found 800 years ago, when he had no strength left for anything but trusting in the mercy of God. Go in peace. Pray with memory, with real humility, with total surrender. And rest tonight knowing your petition, however impossible it feels today, is already on its way to the very heart of God.